Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, August the 21st, 2025. A couple of weeks ago, I did a show with a Brazilian energy activist, Isabel Bernanke. She had a new book out called Rad Future, The Untold Story of Nuclear Electricity and How It Will Save the World. We're doing another show about a kind of energy that will save the world, but a very different kind of energy, the sun rather than nuclear energy. Bill McKibben is one of the world's leading environmental thinkers and activists. He believes that 4.5 billion years on, the sun is having a moment, and he's packed this moment into his new book, appropriately called Here Comes the Sun. Bill is joining us from the spine of the Green Mountains in Vermont. I hope, Bill, the sun is shining there.
Actually, we're having a little bit of rain today, thank heaven, because we've been stuck in a nasty drought all summer long.
So, Bill, I can't resist on this one. This stuff on nuclear electricity, Google has just announced that it's also investing massively in nuclear energy. Is it either or when it comes to the sun or nuclear, or all forms of energy good if they're done right?
Well, all forms of low carbon energy have their uses. The point about nuclear power is that someday down the road, it may play some significant role if we get good at building small modular reactors, the things that people are hoping for. But that's not where we are now. Where we are now is that we're installing sun, wind, and batteries. That's the holy trinity at a rate 100 times faster than we're building nuclear power anywhere in the world. That big Google announcement was, if I recall correctly, for 500 megawatts worth of nuclear power sometime between now and 2035. 500 megawatts is half a gigawatt. The Chinese were installing 3 gigawatts worth of solar panels every day in the month of May this year. They were putting up the equivalent of a gigawatt-sized nuclear power plant every 8 hours with solar panels. 95% of the new generating capacity that came on stream this past year around the world and in America were from sun and wind and batteries. So that's the scalable, real, and big story now. And I try to remind my friends who keep hoping for a nuclear renaissance at some point that, in fact, what we're doing at the moment is just taking advantage of the largest nuclear reactor we know about, the one that's 93 million miles up in the sky and sends us unlimited power every single day of the year.
Yeah, nuclear renaissance might be a contradiction in terms. We expect bad news, Bill. You know this as well as anyone on the environmental front. But your book is optimistic. Would that be fair? Are you arguing that the subtitle of the book is A Last Chance for the Climate and a Fresh Chance for Civilization? But this last chance is a real one. It's not a dire moment. We're actually on the way to.
No, it's a hell of a dire moment. I wrote the first book about what we then called the greenhouse effect, what we now call the climate crisis, back in the 1980s, a book called The End of Nature. And ever since then, for 35 years, I've been sort of chronicling this story. And sad to say, it's coming out exactly how these scientists said it would, except a little bit faster. We're busily melting the polar ice caps. The jet stream and the Gulf Stream are now degrading in real time. We're seeing temperatures higher than we've seen in at least the last 125,000 years. And with the attendant chaos that comes when you introduce more energy into a closed system. That's those fires, those floods, all the other traumatic effects of rapid warming. What we do have, finally, is a scalable thing that will not stop global warming. It is too late for that, but hopefully knock some tenths of a degree off how hot it gets. And in our world, every tenth of a degree Celsius that we raise the temperature moves about 100 million people out of a comfortable climate zone and into the place where they're likely to have to move, flee, or die. So this is good news within limits if we really embrace it and move very quickly to deploy it. But that speed is crucial. And that's the place where the fossil fuel industry is desperately trying to slow down this transition, nowhere more obviously than in the US.
Yeah, but you've argued that the future is solar with or without the US. I don't want
It's
to turn this into another Trump
true.
conversation.
It's true.
But can I mean, is the US is not as central in this as perhaps some people might imagine?
It's not as central as it once was, and it's making itself less central with every passing day. You know, the US represents about 11% of emissions that are driving climate change. So it would be very nice to have us on board, but at least for the moment, we're not going to be in a big way. That won't stop the rest of the world. In fact, it may speed it up some. Clearly, the winners here are the Chinese, who have taken two pieces of American invented technology, the solar cell and the lithium ion battery, and are using them to ride to the forefront of the global economy and probably the global political power structure in the course of the next couple of decades. China already has, I think, made the transition from it's not a petro state, it's the world's first electro state. And it is beginning to dominate not only the production of solar panels and batteries, but all the things that go with them. Probably most conspicuously, EVs. The world's car market all of a sudden no longer hinges on Detroit. It hinges on 3 or 4 Chinese cities where we're producing more cars, better cars, and more advanced cars than anything that's happening in America.
Bill, I'm just back from Zanzibar. I'm not sure if you've been there. Lovely place.
It is a fantastic place.
Fantastic place. And I was struck by the very new airport there that, surprise, surprise, has been built by, quote unquote, the Chinese. The Chinese are investing massively in Africa, politically, economically, environmentally, because, of course, of the access to rare minerals, which are essential to the solar revolution. Is this of concern to you, the political implications, given the and what you would call it, the chemical architecture of solar, that it does require rare minerals that are deeply problematic and scarce on lots of fronts?
Sure, it's problematic in lots of ways, but it's it's also a huge solution. If what you're worried about at some level is the amount of mining and the both environmental and human degradation that goes with that, the transition to renewable energy is much more of a solution than a problem. That's because if you think about it, we're exchanging one kind of world for another. If you go mine some lithium someplace and put it in a battery, then that lithium works for a quarter century doing its thing. If the battery eventually degrades, you can, and we now do routinely, recycle them to get the lithium back out and start all over again. Uh, Compare that with, say, coal. When you mine some of that, you set it on fire, and then you have to mine some more tomorrow. So the Rocky Mountain Institute last fall put out a study saying all the minerals that you'd need for the battery transition between now and 2050 will require less mining than coal required last year. A way to think about it in your mind's eye is a shipload of solar panels coming from someplace, say China, will over their lifetime produce 500 times as much energy as the same ship loaded with coal. We're moving into a less materialized world as we make this transition. And I think over time, we're moving into a world less able to be dominated by elites and oligarchs and governments. China will happily sell you solar panels now, but once they do, the sunshine is is falling on your country or your roof, and it's yours to work with. If you think about, just as a sort of mental experiment, think about how different the geopolitics of this planet would have been over the last 70 years if oil and gas and coal were of trivial value. Think about the world that we create that runs on sun and wind, and how difficult it will be to figure out ways, though humans will doubtless try, to fight wars over sunshine.
Bill, your book, the blurb from the publisher around the book begins by suggesting that our climate and our democracy are melting down. You touched on politics earlier. The Chinese are powering this solar revolution. I take your point that once they sell us their solar panels, they can't interfere in our business. But of course, the Chinese are, so to speak, pioneering a very different kind of political system, maybe an enlightened authoritarianism, centralized authoritarianism. We've done lots of shows on the Chinese model, as opposed to the American one. Are you concerned as an American
Sure.
that it seems as if the Chinese model of centralized, enlightened authoritarianism seems more successful than the American model in terms of saving the planet?
I'm really concerned. I've spent a lot of time in China, and there are things about it I admire, but I wouldn't want to live there because, given how I've spent my life as an advocate and organizer, they would have had me in jail a long time ago. That said, it makes it all the more infuriating that the US is squandering its technological leads and advantages here. The Biden administration was trying hard to catch up. That's what this Inflation Reduction Act was about, an effort to inject some capital into our system to allow us to begin to challenge them on batteries and solar panels and things like that. And of course, that was immediately overturned by the new Republican Congress and Trump administration. And I think that was a tragic mistake. I don't think China's eating our lunch. I think a sort of cadre of red-capped waiters is serving it to them. And as an American patriot, I find that truly sad.
So what is to be done? I mean, in terms of rethinking American democracy, you're an activist on lots of fronts.
Yep.
We'll talk, I think, about the Day of Action, Rise Up for a Sun-Powered Planet, which I know is happening on September the 21st. But we do many shows on the restructuring of American democracy.
Yep.
Is there a need for that to take place in parallel with the solar-powered revolution that you're writing about in this book?
I think so. Our democracy is obviously under stress in a way that it hasn't been in my lifetime. And I find that a difficult thing to even quite understand. The pictures of federal troops in the streets of Washington, D.C., on and on, are foreign to everything that I think of when I think of my country. We're not going to change that in Washington over the next 18 months. That seems locked into place, what's happening in the federal government, at least until there are some new elections. But there are enormous number of things that we can do at the state and local level to make them more effective on a wide variety of things. And this is a place where renewable energy, solar power, is a kind of perfect template for how you might make those changes to make state and local governments much more nimble and effective. I've been doing a lot of reporting on an interesting conundrum, and see what you think of it. Is putting solar panels on your roof, which is going to be one of the important acts of the 21st century, costs about 3 or 4 times as much in the US as it does in Australia or the EU. And a little bit of that is because we've put extra tariffs on solar panels, but mostly it's because of the Byzantine, Baroque permitting systems that require you to jump through all these hoops. There's 14,000 municipalities in America, and each one has their own set of codes and rules and things. Happily, it's easy enough to change these for this purpose, and it's a pioneering way to start at work on making that government more effective. There's a series of apps that allow for instantaneous permitting for a contractor with a local government, and they've been now put in place in California, New Jersey, and Maryland. We're working hard to bring them to the other states. They're also just straight ahead laws that need to change. And let me give you an example. Across Europe over the last 3 years, there's been an explosion in very small scale solar, what we call balcony solar, for people living in their apartments. Something like 3 million Germans have gone to whatever their equivalent of Best Buy is, come home with a solar panel and hang it from the veranda of their apartment and just plug it directly into the wall, and with no more muss or fuss than that, often supply 20% of their electricity. That's illegal every place in the US, except, and this is an interesting political moment, except the deep red state of Utah, which 2 years ago, by unanimous vote of its state legislature, made balcony solar legal. Because, as one libertarian state senator said, why should the people in Hamburg and Frankfurt be able to do something that the people in Provo and Salt Lake City can't? When you reflect on that, or you reflect on the fact that renewable energy is now going up faster in Texas than it is anywhere else in the US, you get some sense that this could cross ideological boundaries in deep ways. What it can't do is bail out the fossil fuel industry, who have been spending huge amounts of cash to game our political system, because they realize that their business model and their cash cow is in serious trouble. If the sun's willing to supply energy for free, we aren't going to need much longer those people who figured out how to hoard it in reserves and dole it out to us piece by piece.
And of course, the geopolitical element of that in terms of America's Middle Eastern strategy is significant. A couple of months ago, I'm not sure if you saw, there's an excellent new movie out, Bill, on a lot of this stuff, Lithium Rising, by the Samuel George at the Bertelsmann Foundation, The Race for Critical Minerals. One feature of the movie was the way in which one northern French town, I think it was Calais, are rebuilding their entire industrial economy around renewables and solar power. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what's happening in Calais, but can American cities and regions learn from other parts of the world, like northern France, in terms of reinvention?
Absolutely. And some of them are. I mean, the story in California over the last 2 years is quite remarkable. The state does not do everything right in this regard, but it did enough right over the last 5 or 6 years that it reached some kind of tipping point. California, over each of really almost every day this year so far, has supplied more than 100% of the energy it uses from renewable power for long stretches of the day. At night, when the sun goes down, our fourth largest economy turns first now to batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon. They're the biggest source of supply off the grid. And as a result, California this year is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity than they were just a couple of years ago. That's a really important turn, and it shows the way for the rest of the country. Texas, as I say, seems to have been the most apt pupil and following most closely the possibilities. But it's not just that we can learn about how to produce energy. It's about learning how to use it in smart ways too. And there are cities around the world that are beginning to show real change really fast. I don't know if you've been to Paris in the last year or two, but it's remade itself into a city for bikes and for e-bikes, which may turn out to be an invention as important as the EV. I mean, the bike was already elegant technology, but now we have a bike that doesn't have any hills. And that's probably going to be in the long run more important than the EV for more people on this planet as we move in that direction.
Yeah, as someone who lives on top of a very steep hill in San Francisco with an e-bike, I couldn't agree more. And I have an electric vehicle too. Bill, I'm sure you're keeping up with a lot of the debates in the US about reinvention. Of course, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book Abundance focused on this, and they actually look at California rather differently, trying to make sense of the fact that California can't build high-speed trains in comparison to China. I'm sure you've seen, perhaps even read the Klein book on abundance. Oh, yeah. Why don't Klein? I don't want to turn this into a critique of Klein and Thompson. They do good work, and we've done a number of shows, not just on their work, but on other people's analysis of why stuff isn't happening in America. But why don't they focus as much on solar, perhaps, as they should?
Well, so first of all, I think that their work is in many ways very smart. And one of the places where California is terrible is when it comes to this rooftop solar on people's homes. Where you live in the San Francisco Bay Area is probably the single hardest place in the world to get permits to put up solar stuff on your roof. I just wrote a long piece for Mother Jones exploring all that. And
yeah, it's a sort of near, and it's a classic kind of. We have solar panels, so we on our roof, so we went through it. But it's the NIMBYism that the left is so now torn over.
It's insane. But I think the larger question about why people haven't been paying as much attention to solar is a super interesting one, and really, it's why I wrote this book. It's happening very, very fast. This is an entirely new phenomenon. For the last 40 years, fossil fuel has been cheap and renewable power has been expensive. Sometime 5 or 6 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where the solar power became the cheapest power on Earth. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to make energy is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And that's triggered, especially in China, this remarkable build out at just warp speed. But it's hard for us to notice this because and I think this is a classic case of how humans think about things. We've labeled sun and wind in our minds as alternative energy. That's the file folder that we've stuck it in. And it's no longer correct. It's now the common sense, straightforward, obvious way to produce our power. The analogy I've been using is we're used to thinking of renewable energy as the Whole Foods of energy. It's nice, but pricey. It's not anymore. It's the Costco of energy. Cheap, available in bulk, on the shelf, ready to go. And if we have one real goal for this Sunday thing that we're putting together for September 21st, it's that. It's to move it into a new place in our minds, to allow us to understand that it's not alternative energy anymore.
Does it concern you in any way, Bill, that while this revolution is taking place, the demand for energy is dramatically rising because of the AI revolution? Times last week wrote a big piece about how big tech's AI data centers are driving up electricity bills for everyone. Krugman wrote about how power hungry AI is, more and more articles about how much energy AI will really consume. Is this a parallel development, or are they bound up?
Yeah, they're connected in certain ways. Let me say, first of all, that, and this is more your area than mine, but I remain a little agnostic about exactly how much of those data centers and things are ever going to get built out. I think we're living in a bit of a hype bubble around AI. But that said, if we're going to do it and build them, and this is a point that both that Times article and Paul Krugman made, it's entirely obvious that the way to do it is to build out solar power, wind power, and batteries to make them work. In fact, that's the only thing, the only way to do it, because the defining feature of this theoretical AI race with China is that we have to go very fast. And these are the only things that you can build very fast. There was a big paper from a bunch of people in Silicon Valley last year saying, if you're going to build data centers, this is the most economical and, in fact, only way to get it done. But what did the Trump administration do when it took office? Two things. One, it declared a national energy emergency because we need energy, it said, for data centers. And two, it immediately said, we're not going to build any solar or wind because really those would conflict with the business model of our patrons in the fossil fuel industry. So it's creating an artificial emergency here that's going to end us up in a lot of trouble. I was writing about this last week in my newsletter, and the the rise in electricity prices when you increase demand and constrict supply, which is what the Trump administration is doing, is just a guarantee, and it's going to do a lot of damage.
We mentioned Google. They're investing in nuclear energy and in AI. They're trying not to cannibalize their own search business, which of course is existentially challenged by AI. You mentioned the traditional energy companies. The Exxons and the Mobiles and all the rest of them of the world, not your greatest friends or mine for that matter. But can they reinvent themselves as well, Bill? Why wouldn't they be massively investing in solar?
So this is a truly interesting question. And if you look back at the history of technology changes, it's very, very rare that incumbents are able to make the leap to the new technology. The guys who built horseless carriages weren't the guys who built cars in the end. In this case, it's particularly hard for an interesting reason. The CEO of Exxon explained last year that his company was never going to invest in renewable energy because, as he put it, it doesn't offer above average returns for our investors. And he's right. The business that John Rockefeller pioneered offered above average returns because you controlled the supply of the energy and made everybody write a check for it every month. That's no longer possible. Yes, you can make money putting up solar panels and wind turbines, and people are making money, and there will be solar and wind billionaires. But I think there are unlikely to be solar and wind plutocrats of quite the way that John D. Rockefeller and his heirs became. And the reason is that once the solar panel is up, the sun delivers the energy for free. If you're Exxon, that's the silliest business model of all time. But if you're everybody else in the world, it's a great thing. It reduces the cost of doing business for everyone. There was a big meta study out of Oxford 2 years ago that I've written a fair amount about and that I talk about in the book. And they said that the faster this energy transition takes place, the cheaper it will be. The world will save tens of trillions of dollars. And the reason is simply that the world will no longer have to pony up constantly for more coal and gas and oil. So that's the world we're heading into if we can get there. And of course, that's the world that the fossil fuel industry wants desperately to stop. If I know that California is burning 40% less natural gas, surely the people back at hydrocarbon headquarters in Houston know that they're burning 40% less gas, and it scares the dickens out of them. That's the definition of a dramatic transition.
Your argument rather sounds like the Beatles song of 1969. Of course, Here Comes the Sun, in its optimism. Are there any arguments, environmental arguments, Bill, against this? Is there anything that concerns you? You're presenting it almost as too good to be true, like apple pie or the American dream. But
there is no free lunch, but there are more expensive and less expensive lunches. And this one, to me, falls squarely in the category of radically less expensive lunch. So even the things that, when I started looking at this, worried me, have come to worry me a lot less. Obviously, solar power takes up some space. We'll put a lot of it on our roofs, but some of it's going to have to go in farm fields and things like that. And when you first think about that, you think, well, that's too bad. But if you think about it a little more deeply and start going to visit some of these places, your opinion begins to shift. In the first place, it's a lot more efficient than what we're using a lot of our fields for at the moment. America's biggest crop is corn. And literally half of our corn in this country is just turned into ethanol, gasoline. So those cornfields are essentially solar collectors, but inefficient ones that you have to pour a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus on to make them work. And even when you make them work, they don't produce that much energy. I was in a cornfield in Illinois last summer with a guy who had just used part of his farm for a solar array. He said, look, on an acre of corn, my corn, I can grow enough ethanol to drive a Ford F-150 pickup, America's most beloved vehicle, about 25,000 miles. If I take that same acre and cover it in solar panels, my Ford F-150 Lightning, the EV version of the same truck, gets not 25,000 miles off that acre, but about 700,000 miles. The increase in efficiency is astonishing. And when you're actually out there in the field, you start to see that the solar panels only take up about half the field. In between them are big rows, which people are learning to use in all kinds of different ways. One of the fastest growing ideas on planet Earth is what we're calling agrivoltaics. And what people are discovering is on an overheated planet, shade is a real commodity. It makes it easier to grow things and easier to maintain moisture, retain moisture in those fields. So, for instance, I don't know if you're a wine drinker or not, but I was just looking at some studies from France showing 60% increase in yields for wine grapes grown in fields with solar panels. Here in Vermont, where I live, we increasingly interplant the solar arrays with pollinator-friendly native plantings that have increased by orders of magnitude the number of insects in the field. And in return, the surrounding farms are finding that fruit set in their orchards and things like that goes up 30 and 40%. So I think what we're seeing is a kind of shift in possibilities here, a move away from the industrialized monoculture agriculture that dominates everything across America, and in the direction of something that provides farmers with a steady income, but that also leaves them room to experiment in all kinds of interesting ways.
It's interesting you bring up farming. We've done a number of shows on regenerative agriculture, one last year with George Monbiot, your fellow activist. I'm sure you're all too familiar with many of the books about regenerative agriculture. Is it an either or, Bill, when it comes to solar versus thinking about the soil and regenerative soil, or do these two things go together?
In this case, they go very much hand in hand. If you think about it, I mean, we're going to need to cover someplace between 1.5% and 2% of the country with solar panels. And that's land that in effect, that's soil that gets to rest for a while. And it's not like it's being damaged. You just pull out the solar panels if your guest from earlier this summer is right, and 25 years from now we have small modular fusion reactors that we can plug in to produce our power. Well, then we can pull up the solar panels and go back to work on on that land, or hopefully in ways that are more elegant than we're using it now. So I think this works hand in hand with careful and interesting thinking about the landscape, which is not something we've been very good at, frankly, for a very long time.
This is not just good for the earth, but as you argue, it's practical. A lot of people are going to be listening to this, Bill, and thinking, well, what can I do there? There's solar powers, there's EVs. Is that really what it's all about? And we've done lots of shows on what people can do, because we can talk about these meta issues until the cows come home, but most people actually want to participate.
Absolutely, and rightly so. People can do two things. One is they can go transform the place where they live or their community or their campus or whatever it is. Right now would be a very good time to do that. Thanks to the Republican Congress, the tax credits that were supposed to last for a decade for putting up solar power are going to expire on New Year's Eve. So if you want to do it, now would be a good time to call up your local contractor. But I'm an organizer too, albeit a volunteer at it. People need to also come together to demand more systemic change. That's why we do things like Sunday. So people can go to sunday.earth and figure out how to join in on this big day of action on September 21st. There are going to be all kinds of things, EV parades and solar powered concerts, and there'll be some protests in places where people are fighting new gas pipelines that we don't need because we could be using clean technology. Everywhere, it'll be an effort, as I said before, to kind of change our mental construct of what this stuff is, that it's the clear way forward that we need to move. And this is the key thing here, quickly on. We wouldn't need to move quickly absent the climate crisis. Absent that, 40 years from now, we're going to run the planet, I think, on sun and wind because it's so cheap. But if it takes us anything like 40 years to get there, then the planet we run on sun and wind will be a broken planet. And that's what I desperately want to avoid. We're watching our physical systems on this earth erode in real time. And once they erode, there's really no going back. Nobody has a plan for how you refreeze the Arctic once it's been melted. Our best guess is we have a very short period to do this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the kind of gold standard climate scientists who study this, put out a report a couple of years ago saying we need to cut emissions in half by 2030 to stay on anything like the timeline we set out in Paris just a decade ago. So given that need to move quickly, the only tool that we have that scales in time to make a real, appreciable, calculable difference is this sudden gift of cheap energy from the sun.
In other words, Peter Brannon's been on the show. He's going to come on the show again in a week or two. This thing he's warning us about, this sixth major mass extinction, that's a reality too, in the face of what you're arguing in Here Comes the Sun.
It sure is. I just reviewed his book for the New York Review of Books, and I think it's a brilliant book, especially the historical parts, cataloging the previous 5 mass extinctions. We're in an incredibly dangerous place. And look, there are scientists who argue we have waited too long to get started on doing something about it. I think the best science indicates we still have a window, but it's a very narrow one, and it's closing fast to really make much difference in how hot the planet eventually gets.
Finally, Bill, this is, in a sense, your third act. You're the founder of Third Act, a community of Americans over 60 determined to change the world for the better. How does this fit in, this third act for you, which is perhaps a more optimistic act than some of the other acts? You note that you were one of the early activists. You've written some of the most influential books warning of our environmental crisis. How does this book and the sun activism, Here Comes the Sun narrative, how does it fit into your third act?
Absolutely.
As Bill McKibben.
So we started Third Act 3 years ago to organize older people like me for action on climate and democracy. And there's now about 100,000 of us nationwide with big working groups in every state. If you meet any people our age, send them our way. It's been remarkable. People told us as we started that older Americans became more conservative as they aged. And so this would be very hard. But that hasn't been our experience. And I think it's because if you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, it means that the first act of your life was in that period of intense social, cultural, political transformation of the 1960s and 1970s. Those people are still alive and they have a lot of muscle memory from that youth. In this case, the best example is the first Earth Day in 1970, still the biggest demonstration in American history. 20 million Americans, 10% of the then population, flooded into the streets. And as a result, a corrupt Republican administration, Richard Nixon's, within 2 years had given us the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the EPA, all those templates used around the world to clean up the environment. Dennis Hayes, the guy who founded that first Earth Day, is working hard with us as we go towards Sun Day. He's a part of Third Act, and so are lots and lots of other people who are realizing that their legacy, the world they leave behind, may be worse than the one they were born into. Nobody wants that. And so older people have proved to be truly valuable parts of this fight, both for climate and democracy. And it's been a lot of fun to be organizing with them. I've spent much of my life organizing with young people. That's great too. The problem with young people is they grow up, 4 or 5 years later, they've got a job and a kid. If you organize someone when they're 60 or 65 to be an activist around this, the actuarial tables indicate that they're good for another quarter century of powerful work. So I'm very glad that we've got this going.
Well, Bill McKibben, author of Here Comes the Sun, You're Not Going Away. I would run the George Harrison song as the outro, but I'd probably get into trouble from the Harrison estate. So we can imagine it, Bill, but it certainly is an encouraging message and some encouraging music from someone who hasn't always provided the most encouraging music. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say it's a pleasure to me to be bringing, for once, a little bit of good news. We're in a moment of a lot of big bad things happening on our planet. This is the one big good thing, I think, that's underway. So we should seize it and make the most of it.
Well, we need to put that in a bottle, a cheerful Bill McKibben, which I think is encouraging on lots of fronts. Wonderful new book, Here Comes the Sun, a last chance for the climate, a fresh chance for civilization. Bill, keep doing your remarkable work. We need to get people for Sunday, September 21st, also for your third act. We'll get you back on the show to talk more. I hope there'll be a